I thought we'd talk a little bit about denial of service attacks. We talk about specific cases from time to time, but and in particular, Kaspersky came out with a report. They're doing basically a comparison of the fourth quarter 2014 denial of service attack activity that they're able to track, as well as and doing a comparison with the first quarter 2015 to see how things are changing. And generally speaking, what they were doing is saying that overall things are down a little bit, but they also have a qualifying statement that this is limited to attacks from botnets analyzed by Kaspersky. So there's a good possibility that the attack activity has actually gone up, but their ability or the botnets that they know about, or perhaps the methods that are used. So for example, later in the report, it talks about the types of attacks that they saw. I saw almost no reflective denial of service attacks included in it, relatively speaking. It was a lot of sort of SYN attacks and that sort of thing. So my suspicion is perhaps the types of attacks have shifted somewhat and perhaps not connected directly with the botnets they're using. That's just speculation on my part, but nevertheless, interesting observation. We talk a lot about scanning activity and things in the weather report. A lot of that is actually attributable to China. There's obviously stuff coming from a lot of other countries as well. What we very rarely ever talk about is the fact that China is also a target of a lot of attacks. And that's very clear in this report. Basically, almost twice as many as denial of service attacks are targeting China in comparison to the United States. So very curious and interesting observation that I just wanted to share with you here. So China, US, second place, Canada in third place, with some growth in Canada comparatively speaking, and also some growth in Russia, which I think they said that were most of the targets, or the most significant targets, were some financial institutions in China. So perhaps some monetary motivation behind those attacks. So what I thought we would do next here is just talk a little bit about the defenses against denial of service attacks. And this actually comes from Charles Herring. He's a consulting security analyst at Landcoop. The recommendations he makes here, 5 defenses against denial of service attacks. First of them on the list, he talked about oversubscribing bandwidth. Now, I've actually talked with organizations, customers that have attempted to do this as a mitigation strategy. We're going to see a little bit later where I don't think that's a real practical thing to do. But oversubscribing is an important part. This is a quote from Charles himself. There is no such thing as a perfect defense against denial of service attacks. So what you need to do is expect that some of the attack may leak through. That is, even if you're using a mitigation provider to scrub out the attack activity, they may get 99% of it out. But if you're looking at attack that's many gigabytes or gigabits per second of traffic activity, you're going to need to be able to absorb a little bit. So the recommendation is don't establish your bandwidth based on say a 90% utilization on the network for a service that you have offered onto the internet. Second one, automated mitigation. We're going to take a look at an example a little bit later to help support this as well. That is, ultimately, you can't go in and look for the addresses that are doing attacks. It is typical that it will leave thousands of addresses, and to be able to try to transcribe and type in addresses into a blocking strategy and expect an access control list to be able to handle that is not a real practical approach to things. So automation is necessary as a part of this activity as well. And that's just one example. Sometimes you're not able to use addresses as a blocking strategy. Outsourcing to expert security firms. My interpretation is subscribe to a denial of service mitigation service provider. Ultimately that's going to help you quite a bit. Restricting access to UDP and TCP sources. I think ultimately, if you don't need the port to get to your application, block it. I mean, oftentimes, in fact, particularly associated with reflective attacks that we talk about frequently here, they're trying to toss UDP port 80 at applications that are really web servers, and that is TCP 80 or TCP 443. So it really does give you a leg up, and to work with your mitigation provider and say, you know what, these ports we don't need, block them right away, and then let's focus on figuring out how to block the bad sources associated with the actual attack activity, if that comes to be. And then system strengthening. I've seen a number of cases where attacks against organizations aren't necessarily trying to fill the bandwidth. They're just trying to, exploit the application itself. And what I mean by that, there's cases where if you have a search tool tends to be a very database intensive activity, trying to search for a term or something like that. That's a method that's used in denial of service attacks, a method that's used to basically try to throw search terms at a search tool that's on a website. So what you might want to do is, if you want to allow folks to do a search, maybe require them to authenticate, have a registered account, or do some sort of CAPTCHA or something like that to restrict it. So that's a couple of methods for system strengthening. So I think the basic concept here are those 5 defenses.
Yes, I was going to mention in terms of system strengthening, another thing we've seen is if you have large PDF documents or other documents that are really large, sometimes attackers will just keep trying to fetch those, because that's going to create a lot of backhauled bandwidth that you're going to have to send back out again. So it's almost like you're impacting yourself.
So perhaps rate limiting on retrieval of particular documents, or perhaps make a frequency count like we do with password guessing. You only allow a few password guesses before you lock out that account. You might want to do that for a particular source. If they've downloaded it 10 times already, you'd think they got it already, right? So good point. Another good strategy for system strengthening. So anyway, to help reinforce this is a typical denial of service attack that was actually quite recent that we helped with a customer in mitigation. In this case is an example, just as I referred to earlier, where the predominant attack method here was a reflective denial of service attack, and they were directing, it probably came from port 1900 UDP, we'll talk about that in a moment here, and directed toward port 80 UDP. Well, and I don't know specifically in this case, but if that were a web server, it really doesn't need 80 UDP. And so that's one aspect of this. The other aspect here is in the profile, that this bottom graph is basically showing, oh, by the way, this attack peaked up around 17 gigabits per second. And so not too many organizations are buying tens of gigabits of internet service. And so that's the reason that it makes sense to have a mitigation provider that has built out literally hundreds of gigabits of scrubbing capacity to be able to facilitate this. And you get to share that among the other subscribers. So it's a much less expensive alternative to trying to build that out yourself. Now, in terms of the distribution of the sources that we're seeing here, there are some sources that are really some big hitters here, but I wasn't able to really show it. But if you look over to the right here, this is just showing the first 1,000 sources. It turns out there are actually more than 5,000 sources that contribute to this attack. So you can, as I said earlier, if you're trying to transcribe IP addresses and put them in an access control list, it's not going to be a very practical thing to do, particularly if you're trying to mitigate the attack. This particular attack only continued for about 30 minutes.
But even knocking down the first 100 there would have had a
knocking down the first, it would have helped.
Significant decrease.
You're absolutely. It had a significant decrease in the size of the attack, so long as you had some oversubscribed capacity to be able to suck up the rest of it. So, good point.